for this very kind words of introduction. I should say in the Handbook of Language Contact and the Handbook of Area Linguistics, India was very prominent because of the multilingual situation there. So we're very glad to be able to deal in both those books with the linguistic situations, the different types of situations in India. My talk for today is somewhat different, of course. It's English as a lingua franca, and a bit like Raj Mestri and Edgar Schneider, they're old colleagues and friends of mine. I've been working on the question of varieties of English over the past few decades, so that's sort of my area. But I'd be interested in as well too in this notion of English as a general means of communication across the world today, and that's the topic for my talk today. So without more further ado, I'd like to move into it. Can you allow me to share a screen, please? And then I can move on.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No. So can you see my screen now? Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Not yet.
Not okay. Sorry. Now?
Yes, it is coming.
Okay.
Yes.
And if I page down, can you see the next page?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it's working. Right, there you are. So what is a lingua franca? The term lingua franca is Italian for Frankish tongue and goes back to the Crusades, which during which mixtures of many European languages were used by the military forces operating in the Levant. Since the 17th century, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term can be found with the meaning of a system of communication providing mutual understanding. It is this meaning which is the basis for the presentation today, albeit with many additional aspects added to it. Just a small note to begin with, the Italian plural of lingua franca, of course, is linguae francae. However, I will use the English plural lingua francas, which is more intuitive from the English point of view. There are different practices in that respect. Okay, so some historical remarks on lingua francas. While English is the lingua franca of the contemporary world, this was not always the case. There is actually quite a history to lingua francas, which fluctuated as political situations and cultural attitudes changed. The first and longest lasting lingua franca is Latin, which was the language of learning for Western and Northern Europe from the dawn of Christianity to at least the late Renaissance. It is closely associated with the church and thus a good example of a domain-specific lingua franca, and more on this later on the question of domain specificity. A change in principle for lingua francas arose when contemporary native languages came to act in this function. For Northern and Eastern Europe, the two main languages in this respect are German and Russian. The dominance of German in science and the humanities throughout Northern Europe was due to cultural factors rather than to colonialism, which was the main reason why the languages of many other countries developed into lingua francas. Germany dominated Central Europe after its unification in 1871. German was also the main language of the multilingual Austro-Hungarian Empire, which lasted until World War I. And if you look at academic publications in the 19th century from all throughout Scandinavia, you find that many of them, if not most of them, are in German, because German was the lingua franca for academia throughout Northern Europe up until the First World War. So that's the type of situation which we have as well too. A lingua franca being used for publication purposes, for dissemination of writings. Russian expansion eastwards into Siberia brought the language to a vast region which reaches across to the Pacific Ocean. During the Soviet era, from 1922 to 1991, the Caucasus and Central Asian countries, those indicated in gray in the center of the map in front of you, used Russian as an imposed lingua franca. I'll come back to this notion of imposed lingua franca presently as well. It has nonetheless continued in this function to a limited but ever decreasing extent in the what are called the Central Asian republics and in parts of the Caucasus. But Russian is very landlocked, as you can see, and there are other reasons why it didn't become a major lingua franca, and I'll come to these presently. Now, the notion of an imposed lingua franca. There have been many cases where a language was imposed on a population as a lingua franca by an undemocratic government. This happened not just in Russia, as mentioned, but also during the apartheid era in South Africa, for example. Raj Mestri could have talked about this, of course, with more authority than I can, but just to mention it. The government insisted that Afrikaans be the preferred medium of communication with speakers who did not have this as their first language. In fact, that goes back a long way, and the present situation in South Africa is that there are more native speakers of Afrikaans who are not white Europeans of white European descent than there are in the latter group. So as a lingua franca, Afrikaans has been around in South Africa for a long time. Now, the rise of English during the colonial period. Here's a typical map from 1892. And as you can see from all the labels on the map, English was everywhere during the late 19th century, as we all know. And basically, there are 5 big powers in Europe and then a couple of smaller ones. The bigs in terms of chronology are Portugal, Spain, England, Holland, and France, with Belgium and Germany coming in later on in the 19th century, and Italy in a very small respect, and Denmark also early on, but not very significant in terms of the amount of land that they acquired overseas. So England is among the big 5 of the colonial powers, as we all know, and that, of course, plays a role in its spread across regions overseas. Now, there are various routes English took. Of course, it spread to the Northern Hemisphere to begin with, and then later on with the increased size of ships and the increased quality of the ships with steel hulls, ships could move then to the Southern Hemisphere quite easily. And then the exploitation of the Southern Hemisphere began by the British in the 19th century. But these routes are the routes taken, as you can see, went into the Indian Ocean as well, to India, Sri Lanka, and of course over to Southeast Asia, and on down to Australia and New Zealand in the course of the 18th to 19th centuries. So this gives us the picture we have today. I won't go into the details here. It would take us too far afield. I have to keep to my topic, obviously. But just to mention that the dark blue regions in this current map are those where English is spoken as a first language, and the light blue regions, English spoken as a second language. Now, I'm fully aware that this notion of first language and native speaker is contested in the field, but again, for reasons of time, I can't go into it in detail. But that is as a generalization, I think it still has some validity to talk about first and second languages. But as I say, there are countries such as Singapore and parts of India, of course, too, which would say they use English as a native language as well. So the picture is more differentiated than as I'm presenting here today. So please bear with me for the presentation today when I maintain a fairly simple and general division into first and second language. Now, the rise of English as a world language. A significant part of the legacy of colonialism is the continuation of the language of the former colonial power. This holds for English throughout the Anglophone world today, but also for Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and French in their former colonies. From a pragmatic point of view, the colonial language can be chosen to avoid giving preference to any one of many native languages. That is the case where one is not dealing with settler colonies. So, for example, Angola and Mozambique, vis-a-vis Portuguese in Africa, or Niger and Cote d'Ivoire, vis-a-vis French, again in West Africa. Settler colonies automatically have a continuation of the colonial language via the descendants of the original settlers. So in Australia and Canada for English, Argentina and Mexico for Spanish, etc. Again, I'm aware that the notion of settler colonies needs to be further differentiated. India, of course, is not a settler colony in the traditional sense, where large numbers of people came out and settled in India because the English had a different attitude towards India. India was a country with a long cultural history, which the English respected to a certain extent, at least left India on a higher level in their estimation than other countries in parts of Africa, for example, or Australia. So this notion of a continuation of English as a native language by a settler population doesn't really apply to countries like India. Though, of course, there are Anglo-Indians, a small section of the population, which are the result of pairings of English people with local people in India. So that picture needs to be differentiated, but that would take us again too far afield for the moment. Right, so-called pluricentric languages. English, of course, is a pluricentric language, and those languages are those which spread around the world in the colonial period with the subsequent development of regional centers. The latter may come to dominate and be politically more powerful than the original home country, as happened with Brazil vis-a-vis Portugal, and also with the United States vis-a-vis England. Such developments can have to do with the geography and demography of colonies, both Brazil and the United States are many times larger than the original colonial powers, Portugal and England respectively. In the case of the United States, a number of factors came together to lead to its dominating the English-speaking world, and later the entire world to a greater or lesser extent. So first of all, the geopolitical dominance of the United States. An important factor for the United States, of course, is that it faces both into the Atlantic arena on its east coast and into the Pacific arena on its west coast. So for the European powers, the Atlantic is the only arena they have direct access to, whereas for the Americans, they have access to both large oceans, to the North Atlantic and to the Pacific. And the Pacific Rim countries play an important role in Western United States, as it does in Western Canada as well too. But that provided and still provides the United States with access which the Europeans don't have to this large and increasingly important arena of the Pacific. Then there's also very obvious features, the economic, military, and digital dominance of the United States, which is a result again of various developments in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, and certainly the digital dominance of the United States has meant that English is the default language in the digital world, and I'm sure will remain so basically forever. There's no way that English could be replaced by any other language in this sphere. So its dominance there is assured. So these are other additional factors which play a role in the establishing the very firm position of English as a lingua franca in these domains. So the external reasons for the rise of the United States as a world power and the attendant dominance of its main language, English, would appear to be enough to explain the present-day situation with English as a lingua franca. However, other factors weigh in here, not least of which is the relatively analytic nature of English. There are not many grammatical endings in English, not much inflectional morphology. So that the old adage is borne out, a little bit of English takes you a long way. Now, personally, I believe this is an important factor in the establishment of lingua francas. They need to be morphologically fairly simple. If they have grammatical gender and lots of inflections in nominal and verbal paradigms, that makes them very difficult to use from the word go, whereas that is not the case in English. So a little bit of English takes you a long way, as they say. This situation is radically different from synthetic languages like German and Russian, where grammatical gender and a plethora of morphological rules must be observed the moment you begin to use the language. These are internal structural reasons. There are other possible candidates, of course, for lingua francas. There may well be further structural or representational reasons for a language not being raised to the status of a lingua franca. Chinese is a tone language, and such languages are notoriously difficult to acquire as a second language after childhood, which is when most speakers of a lingua franca begin to learn the language in question. So tone languages are very difficult to acquire as an adult. It's practically impossible. And if you don't manage the tones properly, then basically your language is ridiculous then to the native speakers. You have to master the tones properly to be able to use a language with fluency. And that's very difficult to do as an adult, particularly tone languages, much more than morphological languages, complicated morphology. In addition, Chinese is written with logosyllabic characters, as you all know, which presents a major hurdle to anyone used to the Roman alphabet. So despite the economic clout of China today, Mandarin is unlikely to become a lingua franca outside China, though it has that function within the country's borders. So within China, there's no problem. And you can see in the map here, the lilac regions, the regions where Mandarin is the primary native language, and the 1.4 billion speakers in China can use Mandarin. Of course, it's taught in schools to everybody. But as you can see in the map, then basically any region south of about Shanghai along the southeast coast are regions with other languages, which are different from Mandarin, but where Mandarin or Putonghua is used then as a means of communication then and used in schools and official communications, etc. But the other languages, for example, around the Guangzhou, Shenzhen area, Hong Kong area, is Cantonese, and are very different languages from Mandarin in terms of their tone structure and grammatical structure. So Mandarin is necessary as a lingua franca across the out of the southeast of China, which is the economic powerhouse of China today, of course. So within China, definitely a lingua franca, but not beyond its borders then for other parts of the world. And what about India? Well, of course, we have a huge number of speakers of Hindi today in northern India and closely related languages. But there is, of course, with Hindi, the difficulty which you have with China as well too, and that is that of presentation in script. Hindi uses, of course, the Devanagari script, which, while is based on the phonemic principle, symbols represent sounds, and is hence essentially different from Logosillabaries, like for Chinese or Japanese. It is nonetheless very different from the Latin alphabet. So to be an additional difficulty which would need to be mastered by non-native speakers of Hindi, particularly outside of India, if they were to use the language as a lingua franca. So within India, certainly, and certainly with the trilingual official policy you have, English, Hindi, and then the local language, then Hindi does have this lingua franca function within India, as I've noticed being there and from reading about it, of course, but not beyond the borders of India. Okay, then what about Spanish? The Spanophone world consists of about 480 million native speakers, with maybe up to 100 million second language speakers. Spanish has not become a lingua franca in non-Hispanophone countries. Indeed, it has declined in former colonies like the Philippines. Furthermore, the Spanish-speaking countries of Central and South America do not have the political or economic power to make non-Hispanophones gravitate towards them. So for South America and Central America, certainly Spanish is the dominant language and spoken natively by most of the population. There are, of course, indigenous languages in Central and South America, but the vast majorities of the populations of countries from Argentina up to Mexico is Spanish. But it doesn't, these countries, this region doesn't have anything like the economic clout of the United States or China, and so there hasn't been any spread of Spanish from there. And countries like Philippines, which have a Spanish colonial background, at least up to 1898, their Spanish has declined considerably, and basically English is the lingua franca for the Philippines. But there are Spanish words, of course, in local languages in the Philippines, in Tagalog and Ilocano, Bisaya, and that they have Spanish words as borrowings, but English is the lingua franca for the Philippines today. Right, and what about a lingua franca other than English? Well, the apparent obstacles of complex morphology and a non-Roman script can be overcome if other forces are stronger. So the prevalence of Islam across Arabic-speaking, in the Arabic-speaking world has meant that non-local, supra-regional forms of Arabic are used as a lingua franca from Morocco on the Atlantic coast to Oman in the Indian Ocean. So a huge area right across this broad band below Europe and the north of Africa into the Middle East. So that can happen, of course. And Arabic is also used in religious contexts, as we know, in non-Arabic countries like Turkey, Iran, or Pakistan, where the Quran, of course, is in Arabic. So there can be reasons like that which would overcome the question of complex morphology and a non-Roman script. And what about universal language, the case of Esperanto? Well, Esperanto was developed by the Polish ophthalmologist and eye surgeon called Ludwig Zamenhof, or Ludwig Zamenhof in German, a Polish scholar of German origin, obviously, who lived in the late 19th, early 20th century. So Esperanto is a constructed language. It was intended to ease international communication and has a distinct Romance flavor to it, supposedly making it easy for most Europeans to learn. And there were several examples of constructed languages like this at this time, in fact, the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. Another famous one was a language called Volapük, devised by a German monk called Schlegel. But these various attempts didn't really get very far. However, Esperanto has managed to maintain itself, and today it enjoys a fairly large niche following, but has not become the lingua franca once hoped for it by its early supporters. Now, please, if there are supporters of Esperanto, listen to me. I do not mean that in a negative sense, but I think it's fairly clear in terms of numbers that it hasn't reached the dissemination among non-native speakers or speakers of other languages, which one might have hoped for it, and it is very much a niche following today, an active niche, I should say. Right, then to English as a lingua franca then for the rest of the presentation now. So I want to discuss the notion of domain usage for a moment then, but let's look at the possible situations for a lingua franca just for a second. A lingua franca is the domain-specific use of a language for communication among individuals who do not share a common language with both command with ease. So you have either situation 1 or 2, but not 3. So 1 is a non-native speaker, the man on the left gesticulating, or the person, and a native speaker, the person on the right, then in the dark silhouette. Or you have 2 non-native speakers using English in this case as a common language and communicating with each other, but it doesn't apply, of course, to 2 native speakers. Now, I'm leaving aside the whole question of code switching, which Raj Mestri talked about yesterday, of course, and it's a complicated and very interesting field. So speakers do code switch across languages all the time for a variety of reasons, but code switching scenarios are kept apart from lingua franca scenarios. So I won't deal with them. So under 3, you may well have code switching, but the lingua franca situation is either that of 1 or 2 on the left of the slide here. So either non-native plus native or 2 non-natives. And these 2 scenarios, 1 and 2, play a role in the manner in which the lingua franca is used. So we'll come back to that again and again. Right. Again, domain usage. There are typical lingua franca domains. For example, business, science, technology, academia, our domain for today, of course, for the whole conference. And in these levels, the levels of language are most, in these domains, excuse me, the levels of language which are most important are semantics and to a somewhat lesser extent syntax. Morphology does not play a major role in English and can be broadly neglected here. So for domain-specific lingua franca usage, semantics and syntax are the most important levels of language. And speakers can get by using their phonetics, basically. So phonetics and pragmatics are backgrounded in lingua franca situations. For phonetics, it is enough for the sounds of the lingua franca to be approximated for successful communication. Lingua franca speakers tend to retain their native language pronunciation, which for English would be a foreign accent. But again, in the situation non-native to non-native, that doesn't really matter. The main thing is that the semantics is clear and the syntax can be processed by the speakers in question. So phonetics is not that important. And that's why people in lingua franca situations tend to maintain the accents of their background language, of the native language, of course. There's a scale here, of course, and the scale can range from very poor command of English up to quite fluent command and native-like command of English. So on the upper end of that scale, with lingua francas, of course, you do have speakers who are concerned about phonetics and having a very, an acceptable fluency in the language, phonetic fluency in the language. But broadly speaking, phonetics and pragmatics tend to be backgrounded in the lingua franca situation. Pragmatics is a different issue. It is not immediately apparent when lingua franca speakers do not keep to the pragmatic conventions, or do not keep to English pragmatic conventions. Furthermore, these conventions can vary between varieties of English. We know that, of course, there are different conventions in British English, American English, South African English, Australian English. For communication to be successful, it is necessary for non-English speakers to be broadly aware of cultural practices and their manifestation in language. Such issues as terms of address and general politeness conventions are key to appropriate usage, especially in situations with native and non-native speakers of the lingua franca. So again, in our slide a little while ago, the scenario 1, where you've got a native and a non-native speaker communicating, that's where the pragmatic conventions of English play a role then to make sure that there's no misinterpretation there, misinterpretation in the sense of the native speaker regarding statements from the non-native speaker as perhaps being less polite than they were intended to be. Again, conventions like that are very complicated and subtle, and it's an area where one has to approach it consciously and work at it to make sure that the pragmatics is acceptable then for native speakers of the lingua franca, in this case English. And things like eye contact and distance between speakers and that are important aspects of this situation. There are lots of paralinguistic elements which are important in pragmatics as well. So these are aspects which would certainly be important if one is teaching English as a lingua franca, to know about the cultural conventions which apply in the language of the lingua franca. Okay, Previously, with dead languages like Latin, it didn't matter because there was no pragmatics of Latin, but there is a pragmatics of English and different varieties of English. So these are aspects which have to be borne in mind when one is using English as a lingua franca, because it is both a lingua franca and a native language for millions of people as well. Right, then to English in Asia and its future as a lingua franca. So the locations, as we know, of course, is what used to be called the Indian subcontinent, now basically South Asia. So it's India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, maybe Bhutan, if you want to add the geographical completeness. Of course, Nepal was never a colony of England, of Britain, but was heavily under English influence during the Raj. So it's basically this geographical entity would include Nepal. Okay. Then southeast of Asia, of course, the island region, you can see on the right here, and the main Anglophone regions are Malaysia, Singapore, sort of a special case. The Philippines, again, with an American influence from 1898 to the Second World War, and Hong Kong, of course, from 1898 to 1997, the handover back to China. So that's, again, a complicated situation with many different types of scenario. And then, of course, there's English in East Asia, primarily China, South Korea, and Japan, where English, again, was not represented through colonialism, but its presence there. Well, the Chinese situation is difficult. I appreciate that fully, of course. There's a lot of trade interaction with China, very negative behavior on the part of the colonials, of course, vis-a-vis China with the opium trade and the exploitation of the Chinese economy in the 19th century. But there weren't large numbers of settlers of English in China. They didn't have a large administration in China. Of course, there were the factories in Guangzhou, as we know, but there wasn't the presence in China that there was, we'd say, in India, India or the Philippines, the Americans, for example. So the Eastern Asia arena will be an arena of English as a foreign language, where the lingua franca would be a foreign language for most speakers. Okay, but English in China would be a topic for a separate presentation, of course. So the Chinese speakers listening here, please bear with me if I'm very general in my remarks about China, but I'm aware of the complex relationship of England and the different European countries to China throughout the 19th century. Okay. So what can one say about English in South Asia and Southeast Asia? English in Asia is the result of a specific kind of non-settler colony. For instance, in a country like India or Pakistan, well, now Pakistan, then the Raj, and thus forms a good contrast to settler colonies like the United States, Canada, or Australia. English in Asia is often the result of different historical inputs, British English in South Asia, but American English in the Philippines. English in Asia is the result of complex interactions of background languages and learner varieties of English, for example, in Hong Kong or in Malaysia. And of course, English in India, where the Indo-Iranian and Dravidian languages influence varieties of English in different ways. English in Asia consists of many different levels of second language competence and can thus help us in our understanding of learner varieties of English. English in Asia is also shows emergent sets of quasi-native speaker varieties in countries like Singapore, and increasingly for certain sections of the population in India. Now, this whole question of who's a native speaker is a very contested one. It's a hotbed of different opinions. I'm very aware of that. There are sort of pragmatic definitions of native speakers. So anybody who grows up exposed to language X and has language X in school throughout their entire childhood can be regarded as a native speaker. And that is the attitude adopted by many Singaporeans today, particularly Singaporeans of Chinese heritage, who say we speak English at the home, have done so from the word go for our children. They go to English-speaking schools, primary schools, and are fully competent in English afterwards. So are they native speakers, just like the English of the Americans, Canadians? My answer to that would be yes. There's no absolute definition of native speaker in the sense of the heritage definitions that you must have native speakers' parents and grandparents and grandparents going back through history. That does not have to be the case. And if you have populations in India, of course, nowadays increasingly you would have, of people who bring up their children entirely with English. The children go to school, primary school, in English medium schools, then these people then become native speakers of English. And it is not for the Europeans to decide who are good or bad native speakers. People are native speakers, yes or no. And in my own particular case, many of the native speakers from the European or American arena today are actually people who do not have native speakers going back through their history. In my own case, I know that my great-grandfather was a speaker of Irish, the Celtic language Irish. So my family in recent generations transferred from Irish to English. My parents were fully English speaking, but 3 generations ago, my family was Irish speaking. So there are people who have acquired English through a language shift. So the whole question of who's a native speaker and whether one can use family history as part of the definition of native speaker, there's a lot of difficulties involved there. And I tend to adopt a pragmatic attitude. If people's competence in the language is similar to that of other groups claim to be native speakers, then that's fine by me. I think that is an attitude which would generally be adopted today. I think Edgar Schneider, who's listening today, I see would agree broadly with that definition, or Raj as well, Raj Mestri, who spoke yesterday. Again, Raj would be an example of someone whose background, again, is not English background, going back through the generations. So the pragmatic definition of native speaker, I think, is what one should apply today. But it's a big field, and there are lots of different opinions there. Right, number 6 then. English in Asia offers many different linguistic scenarios, and hence can increase our knowledge of types of externally motivated language change. Language change determined ultimately by social and cultural factors. Of course, language change is what makes linguists' hearts beat. So we're always interested in situations of language change and different situations. There are many of these in Asia. There's a very fruitful field for investigating language change, language contact, and language change. I've done myself over many years. So I've always looked to the arena, the Asian arena, for different situations, scenarios of language change, and that can be very fruitful for linguists. And of course, lastly, English in Asia is demographically significant given the number of speakers involved. Now, lingua franca is a language variation and change. The English language is constantly changing, obviously. That's a platitudinous statement, but there we are. There are certain phonetic features which are spreading quickly across the Anglophone world. For example, phonetically, the lowering short front vowels, so pronouncing yes like yas, or saying dras and breakfast, that type of pronunciation, the recent change spreading from North America. There are also many lexical and syntactic innovations which can be seen today. For example, the lifting of restrictions on the use of adverbs, as in that's totally not happening, that sort of thing. And we know things like quotative like, and he was like, why don't we go to my place? That sort of thing. And of course, the vocabulary innovations as well, like using joy for success. Did you do any joy from the insurance company? Were you successful in your insurance claim, for example? Or the use of impossible for really good. That was an impossible goal. It was a really good goal. That sort of thing. So just how sensitive English as a lingua franca can be to such variation and change remains to be seen. But in general, second language varieties second language forms of language react more slowly to ongoing change. And there could also be an aspect which I noticed with South Asian English, certainly Indian English, and that is that the input varieties were varieties from some time back. And certainly for India, 18th and 19th century English would have provided input there. And the teachers of English in India in the 19th century were speakers of English 2 centuries ago. So that many of the forms or structures to find in India are forms which go back to English of 2 centuries ago, which are maintained in India as well too. I always find it interesting to observe that many of the conventions in Indian English would be regarded nowadays by people in Europe and North America as old-fashioned conventions. For example, this use of sir all the time and madam, which has practically disappeared in English in Britain and America, except for service encounters perhaps, but not, we say, among colleagues. I would never call a colleague sir, for example. But it's interesting to see that that is maintained in South Asia and can become a feature then of South Asian English. So it's not just that it's not in any sense regarded as being somehow inappropriate or a mistake, even quite the opposite. It becomes a feature of English in South Asia, that elements which would be regarded by others as outdated or obsolete are maintained in other areas of the world, and because of the input to these regions. And this brings up the whole question of national varieties. So the greater competence in English throughout a country, the more it will develop a profile of its own, which distinguishes it from other varieties. Thus, in South Asia, we have at least Indian English, Pakistani English, and Sri Lankan English, and all with further subdivisions, of course. So specific features of such varieties may well appear in English used as a lingua franca, especially in the realm of phonetics and philology. So we know certainly that things like the retroflexion found widely across both Indian and Dravidian languages in South Asia is prominent in the lingua franca usage of English in South Asia. So that would be a feature of English in South Asia. Now, initially, such features may be regarded as mistakes, in big scare quotes, please, but they may come in time to be seen as features of a national variety and so gain acceptance. And I remember a feature of Sri Lankan English, which I noticed when looking at Sri Lankan English many years ago in some detail, is stress patterns which are different from English in Europe or North America. So you have things like European for European, or circumstance, or terrace for terrace. So different stress patterns. And these sound rather strange to English ears or to North American ears, of course. We have differences in stress between Britain and American English, British and American English, of course, that is true. But there are different stress patterns again in Sri Lankan English, which are different from both British and American English. But my attitude would be they're not mistakes. If, for example, pronunciations like European for European or terrace for terrace is used across the populations of Sri Lanka, then these are features of Sri Lankan English. And they're not mistakes which people make. So mistake is more an individual notion, and it's a notion from language learning and prescriptive language learning. But if non-native features are found across populations, then they are features of these varieties and deserve full acceptance then as being part of a national variety. May not even mean national variety, but part of a variety. Okay, so with time, national varieties can become codified and fixed as standards of their own. So if features of Indian English or Sri Lankan English, maybe Pakistani English as well, become codified and fixed, then they're part of the standard of the country in question. So we may in future have something like standard Indian English if the features we find in Indian English become codified and fixed. And this, by the way, is something which certainly European publishers and English publishers are very open to. I remember discussing this issue with Penny Silva, the general director of the Oxford English Dictionary, and she said, well, look, if there's going to be an Oxford English Dictionary of Indian English, an Oxford Indian Dictionary, then we were prepared to accept anything which the Indian scholars or colleagues would offer us as being typical of broad varieties of Indian English and codify that as being part of Indian English. And with time, of course, you may get a much sharper profile for something like Indian English containing features which are broadly accepted across the entire country. So this process of codification can take place further down the road, if you like. Okay, this then interfaces, of course, with prescriptivism. The spectrum of language use covered by the label English as a lingua franca is likely to include many prescriptive stances on how the language should or should not be spoken and written. For texts in the public sphere, for example, in academic publications, as we know ourselves, it is clear that standard written English is to be used. But for spoken language, a more tolerant attitude should be adopted. And who's going to set the standard? Well, there's no academy for the English language as opposed to Spanish, for example. There's an academy for Spanish. In fact, a set of academies for Spanish. So who sets the standard for English? Well, the answer is, of course, major publishing houses like Oxford University Press. Because standard English arose during the 18th century in England with the rise of the middle classes and education for the majority of the population. And there was no academy then, but publishing houses like Oxford University Press and also Cambridge University Press with their lexicographical works and grammars as well to basically set the de facto standard. Again, typical English to have a de facto standard rather than an officially proclaimed and officially supported standard. Okay. So lastly, lingua franca research. English as a lingua franca is also a vibrant field of research. There are several directions in which this research has been moving. A strongly applied aspect can be recognized, as can a pragmatic one, which sees English as an instrument of communication and not so much a cultural institution with a long history to it. There is a dedicated journal to English as a lingua franca, published by de Groot-Mouton, and a variety of monographs and edited volumes on the subject testifying to the work of language and education scholars. And here are just a few publications. I believe the presentation will be made available to all the participants, so you can look at this in more detail yourself. I'll just go through these slides quickly, just to give you an idea of the spectrum of research in this area of English as a lingua franca. There's quite a lot of pragmatics, academic use, cultural identity through English as a lingua franca, pedagogy for English as a lingua franca. So a broad spectrum of research then in this area. There are also political sensitivities. The European Union presents a classic case of a multilingual organization whose major members, France, Germany, Italy, frequently have difficulties in accepting the de facto role of English as a lingua franca across Europe. Official decrees on the issue are only of moderate value, as the use of English is not determined by lawmakers, but by people in everyday situations. So again, here, despite the attitudes of official institutions, English has become the de facto lingua franca. Now, I've just 2 slides left, so I'm just finished. So the organizers know I won't be going over time. So 2 slides then on the future of English as a lingua franca. So English as a lingua franca covers a wide range of varieties. Specific domains of society, such as economics, science, and technology, will continue to have a strong need for a single standardized language for international communication. So that's here to stay. There's no question of that ever changing, at least not for hundreds of years. We'd have to have a major upheaval across the entire world for that to change. So English as a lingua franca is there to stay for international communication. The more English is seen as deculturalized, that is, as a means to an end, that of successful interpersonal communication, the more the lingua franca function will be maintained on a vernacular level. And we see that in Asia, that English is increasingly seen as a means of communication, but not connected to the country England and its long cultural history. That was the case in the 19th century, certainly for India, where the English were concerned with anglifying, anglicizing the Indians, as you know then from Macaulay's note and everything which followed from that. The English were concerned in making good English people out of Indians, good in a second-class sense, never as good as the English themselves, but there was this notion of inculcating English culture and English history into the Indians to make them good servants of India, servants of England. Now that's completely gone, fortunately. So this deculturalized English is probably the future for English as a lingua franca in interpersonal communication, simply as a means to an end. Now, the lingua franca also interfaces with grassroots English, and thus is seen and will be seen as a means to economic improvement for those striving to partake in the influence of the West and its allies. And of course, we see that with all the migrants, the refugees we have today in Europe, certainly, who come from Central Asian countries, usually from Middle Eastern countries, across over to places like Afghanistan. They look at English as being a means to achieving some sort of economic improvement for themselves. And this is also something which will continue, I think, because a good command of English is certainly opens doors for you in terms of economic improvement. And there's been a lot of research in grassroots English. Recent volume then Edgar Schneider and colleagues did with Edinburgh University Press explores this issue. So grassroots English is again a vibrant area of research. Then English as a lingua franca, of course, will not remain static, but react, albeit somewhat slowly, to changes in English in general. Here, the main motor is and will remain to be the digital world, above all the internet and social media. So English is there to stay in the internet and social media, and will remain in these domains, remain dominant in these domains. And I'd like to finish off, in fact, with a slightly different remark, and it's about getting the balance right. It is true that English is necessary to empower people who wish to enjoy education and partake fully in modern life. These are very practical reasons for engaging with the language. So that's true. We're not arguing about that. But as Professor Kapoor reminded us on the first day, it is important that English does not swamp indigenous languages. Indeed, in many cases, leading to their demise. The linguistic diversity of India, for example, has long been documented and should be preserved as part of the country's diverse cultural heritage. In fact, this documentation goes back at least to the beginning of the 20th century. All the Indians listening will know of Grayson's Linguistic Survey of India, done by an Irishman called George Gerson. So we want to maintain this diversity while still having English as a native language, as a lingua franca, excuse me, lingua franca. So while acknowledging the pragmatic necessity to use English to overcome linguistic barriers, I strongly believe that we should at the same time strive to maintain linguistic diversity, because the languages of the world are part of our common history and the bearers of culture and identity for their speakers. These individuals have the full right to use and foster their native languages so that they can continue to be spoken in the generations to come. So thank you very much for your attention.